Welcome everybody to Business Bites. Good afternoon. My name's Henry. I'm here from the Kent Invicta Chamber of Commerce. Today's session, I'm excited to be joined by Steve Herbert, who's going to be delivering a presentation on the outcomes of the election and how that's going to really affect your businesses. We should have a few moments at the end of the session for a question and answer session. So if you do have any questions throughout, please make sure to put these in the chat and then we will answer these all at the end. So that's enough from me. I'm going to now pass you over to Steve. So Steve, feel free to take it away.
Thank you. Good afternoon, all. I am going to turn my camera off because I don't like looking at me, and I'm sure you don't either. And it's not necessary for this presentation. So hopefully, this will give you a bit of a flavour for how I see things at the moment. I'm trying very hard to avoid any political bias, but things have changed, and we've got to recognise that. But importantly, what the election I think means for the economy, and importantly, what it means for employee well-being and employee productivity and employee engagement. All the things that we need to happen if we are to push forward as a nation and indeed as individual businesses. So, with that in mind, let's start just by taking a step back and looking back exactly 3 weeks to what's just happened. And I'm beginning to think that Keir Starmer is, if you like, a lucky general, to borrow from Bonaparte, because everything seems to be falling into place, not necessarily as a result of things he's done, but just things that are happening around him. If you roll back to the 1980s, one of the reasons that Margaret Thatcher was such a successful prime minister, whether you liked her or not, it's incidental, she was a successful prime minister, was because she faced a completely dysfunctional and completely divided Labour Party. Well, that's kind of where the Labour are with their opposition at the moment. That's the truth of the matter. They are dysfunctional, they are divided, they are not even going to have a new Conservative leader until the 2nd of November, we've just found out. So the truth of the matter is, for the moment, the Labour Party is essentially facing zero opposition in political terms. And that's also doubled up down, if you like, by the reality of this absolutely stonking majority. Now, whether you like that or not is incidental. It's good for business. Generally speaking, business doesn't care what party is in power. What business cares about is certainty of direction. And at least for the next 2 or 3 years, we have some certainty of direction because there is little opposition and there is a very big majority. But his luck doesn't just stop there. Just a few days after he came to power, we had the May growth data. Now, this, of course, has nothing to do with Labour because it predates the election, but it was a very good month for growth. Well, I say a very good month, a better month than we've been used to for the last couple of years for growth in the UK economy. And that just gives everything a bit of a lift. Things are going in the right direction, particularly when you look back across the last 2 or 3 years. So, this chart here shows the growth or the shrinkage in the UK economy month by month. When it's above that red line, the economy is getting bigger, we are getting richer. When it's below that line, the economy is shrinking, we are getting poorer. And you can see there were some really good months in there, the blue bars, where actually the economy grew strongly. But pretty much every single time we had growth from around the middle of 2022 through to the start of this year, it was offset the following month by a period of decline, a period of shrinkage. Yet when we get to this year, all of a sudden we have a little bit of growth. It's not massive growth, but it's certainly much, much better than the stagnation we had before. So there's a bit of confidence growing from the fact the economy is growing, and that's kind of what he's inherited. Other luck, well, by hook, crook, or certainly not by footballing brilliance, the England football team stumbled their way through to the final of the Euros. It wasn't great to watch, but it did lift the nation. It did put lots of money in the hospitality tills. It's all good for a feel good factor, which is what we need in this country to move ourselves away from the stagnation. And the next couple of weeks, with a bit of luck, we as a nation, the GB, if you like, will actually perform really successfully at the Olympics. We're scheduled to be in the top 5 for medals. So even if we miss that by a little bit, we're going to have a good Olympics. Again, good for morale, good for the feel good factor, good for hospitality. And if you take a step back from the UK and look in from the rest of the world, there has been a dramatic change in how we are perceived in the UK. Again, rightly or wrongly, I'm not about the politics here, but ever since that EU referendum in 2016 was called, right the way through to 3 weeks ago, the UK was being perceived as something of a basket case by the rest of the world. They were looking at us. We had no particular plans. There was no structure. We kept changing prime minister. All of those things were bad for the economy and certainly bad for encouraging investors to put money into the country. Whereas all of a sudden, we look like a little bit of an oasis of calm where actually things are centrist and just heading in the right, sensible direction. If you look around the world, so let's start with Europe, we have the rise of the far right in Hungary, in the Netherlands, in Italy, in France. That's not good for the world, and it's certainly not good for investment. No one's going to want to put money into those countries. If you look across the pond, we have the US presidential election, was between two very old men, is now between one old man and somebody else. We think we know who that is, but let's come back to that later. But the truth of the matter is that election is by no means a certainty in any either direction anymore. And we already know that if Donald Trump loses, he's unlikely to accept that, which again makes investment in the US less likely. And if you go to the East, we've got the rise of the dictators. These things are all bad, by the way, for the world, but they are good for how we are perceived as a country, as an investment risk, if you like. Put all that together, and we have confidence, confidence that we didn't have a few weeks ago, which will lead to investment, which will lead to confidence, and so on. So we have some good news here, which is just as well, because we have lots of bad news to consider as well. Let's start with this one. It's by no means the major one, but it's something I'll come back to in this presentation. The UK labour market. About 1 in 5 of the potential workforce in the UK is currently economically inactive. So not in work, not looking for work, not necessarily claiming benefits, completely inactive as far as the Treasury are concerned. That is a huge headwind. Many of those people are economically inactive because they have health issues, and we will come back to that point a little later. And then we have everything else. And this is by no means an exhaustive list. It goes on and on and on. The headline stuff, we have national debt at the highest level in 60 years. We have taxes at very nearly the highest level ever in the UK. We have public spending, well, it's the fourth biggest public spending year ever last year. Yet despite all that money, the public services that we all use are physically crumbling in front of us. We can see it happening in some cases. We have private water companies that shouldn't be an issue in 2024 because they are private for the UK government, but at least 2 of those look likely to fall over during the course of this parliament. And we're back into the too big to fail argument that we saw back in 2007. The government couldn't let these companies fail. They'd have to step in, and that would cost tens of billions of pounds to salvage them. And talking of salvaging, we have 1 in 10 councils in the UK this year that are facing bankruptcy this financial year. Most of them, of course, won't go bankrupt, but even 1 or 2 would make a serious dent on the national coffers. And we have 1 in 5 facing bankruptcy over the course of this 5-year parliament. So that is a really, really bad situation to be in. And lastly, but certainly not least, we have 2 huge compensation claims against the state that have yet to be settled. We have the Women Against State Pension Increases that's been rumbling on for 10, 15 years. We know that's going to cost the state at least £10 billion and probably more. And we have the post office compensation that was agreed and offered the day before the election was called, but hasn't been paid. And that, again, we're looking at tens of billions of pounds. So if you take all that together, it's what led the IFS before the election to say whoever came into power, didn't really matter. They would face this trilemma of whether they need to raise taxes, implement cuts, or borrow more, or all 3. And what's made that particularly difficult is that during the course of the campaign, both the major parties, Conservatives and Labour, had a race to the bottom in saying that they would not increase company taxes, they would not increase VAT, they would not increase national insurance, they would not increase income tax. And if you look at that pie chart of income to the Treasury, that is most of the income to the Treasury that the Labour Party now can't increase against because they gave a manifesto commitment. So raising taxes is out. What about implementing cuts? Well, yes, all governments like to implement cuts if they can, but frankly, there's nothing left to cut. We've been through 14 really difficult years for one reason and another. There isn't much left to cut, which wouldn't cause a problem to the UK. And borrowing more is out. The new Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, has said she will not be borrowing more money, which is the right thing to do, but of course makes the challenges that much more difficult. Yet, there is one thing that has sneaked under the radar and not been mentioned much at all in the media, which is you could take away some tax breaks, particularly tax breaks for business and savers. And we'll come back to that because that can make a big difference to this picture. So Where does that take us next? Well, we know we got all these challenges, and one of those challenges is going back to my point about the workforce, the health and well-being of workers. Because if we don't can't keep people fit, healthy, and importantly at work, then we have a major issue. So I was kind of reassured in a fairly bleak way, frankly, that Wes Streeting, the new health secretary, came out very early and said that the NHS is broken. Now, I've been saying that for years. Any of you that have interfaced with the NHS will know that is true. It's not because we want to be nasty to the NHS, it's just the reality of where we've been. So it's good that finally that's been acknowledged, and it's worth just looking at quite how broken it is. Now, the British Medical Association, the BMA, produce data on all sorts of different criteria around the NHS waiting lists and waiting times and all that sort of stuff. I'm just taking the headline waiting list to give you an idea of how bad things have got over the course of the last few years. So this chart goes back to 2007, the start of the financial crisis. And at the low point, the waiting list in England, and just in England, the low point for waiting on the NHS was 2.3 million people waiting. Big number, but actually within the sort of operational parameters of the NHS to deal with relatively quickly. Then, of course, we had 10 years of austerity. It's not a political point, but if you put less money in, you're going to get less result out. And that's exactly what happened. We went from 2 million people awaiting treatment to 4 million people awaiting treatment on the NHS England waiting list. And the day that austerity officially finished, which was the March 2020 budget, was also the same day that the first payment towards the pandemic was made by the Treasury. So the NHS went seamlessly from 10 years of austerity to the pandemic years, with the obvious impact to waiting lists that we all know about. And as the pandemic receded, they hit everything else, all the problems that have been stored up for the previous 14 years, if you like. The A&E crisis, the social care crisis, staffing, strikes, chemist crisis, and so on and so on. The bottom line is the waiting list as of last week is 7.6 million people awaiting in England alone. If you add the waiting lists of Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, which are all recorded slightly differently, you're probably looking at around 9 million people awaiting treatment in the UK from a population of about 67 million. It doesn't take a genius to work out that that clearly is a huge problem for the UK and indeed for employers too. Particularly that stat from the ONS that around 1 in 3 people awaiting treatment say that actually affects their work or stops them working altogether. And the other 2 in 3, it probably affects them as well. They just haven't said it. So it's a real challenge for everyone and indeed employers. The inevitable knock on for employment, and it's a cost, this is before the pandemic, the average absence per employee per year in the UK was 5.8 days. Last year, that had risen to 7.8 days. So we've got 2 days extra absence from the workplace for every single person across the UK. That clearly is a headwind that we need to deal with, which is why one of the many things included in the King's speech, and it was a hell of a King's speech, about 40 big missions within that speech. Normally it's around 20. One of the key ones clearly was to improve the National Health Service. Good for everybody within the country, but also good for employers and by definition, the wider economy too. And it even went as far as to say that actually they were going to look to level the playing field, if you like, between physical health, which has always been the key focus for the National Health Service, and mental health. And that's really important. And it's important to employers too, because that's 2/3 of the employee well-being triangle. And when you're thinking about the well-being of employees or indeed anybody else, frankly, it comes down to these 3 sides, and they're all equally important: physical health, mental health, and financial health, the one that's always overlooked. And I was particularly struck yesterday when I was driving around to a meeting by an interview with Ewan Thomas, who some of you will recall was a famous British sprinter of the late 1990s, went to the Olympics and I think won silver as well. And Ewan actually went through a really dark patch not so long ago when he became physically ill, injured. And because of his injury, he became mentally ill. And because he was physically and mentally ill, he became financially ill, if you like. He couldn't earn enough money. And that gives you an idea how all 3 sides of this triangle are connected. It doesn't matter whether you're an athlete or somebody working in an office or somebody out on the site. If you've got a problem with one of those 3 sides, it will have a knock on effect to the other 2. So, from the point of view of employers, we need to be thinking about how we support all sides of that triangle. And continuing on that financial point, this is the bit that I think has just been so overlooked over the course of the last best part of 20 years now. is essentially the fact that real pay, by which I mean pay above inflation, so that actually you feel the benefit of that pay increase, hasn't increased and won't have increased even at the end of this year since 2006. Britain needs a pay rise. And that's kind of why the government are doing some of the things they're doing, which we'll come back to in just one second. In terms of inflation, though, the good news is inflation is down to where it should be now, a 2% figure. Yet, if you look at it across the 2020s, by the end of this year, there will have been a 25% increase in the cost of goods since the start of the decade. Very few of our salaries have gone up by 25% over the last 5 years. And that again shows you why the cost of living hurt us so much. But whilst the inflation is down, one of the things that brought it down, which was increasing the bank base rate, is very much up from where it was. So just a few years ago, it was at 0.1%, which was an all-time low, a 300-year historic low, if you like. Now it's at 5.25%, which is where it's been for a little while. And that does have a very significant knock-on effect, particularly to those people with mortgages. And I think there is a mismatch here, which isn't really looked at very much by the media and should be. You get people of my generation, and I'm of a somewhat older generation than many people on this call. People of my generation have a tendency to rumble about, well, interest rates are 5%, big deal. When I took a mortgage, interest rates were 9%, 10%, 11%, 12%. And that was often the case. But what those people are missing is that the housing market has changed dramatically from where it was 25, 30 years ago. Just to give you a flavour of why this hurts much more today than it did in the past. Back in 1991, the average house price in the UK was around £57,000, or as we call it today, a deposit. That was all you needed to find to buy a house. The average salary was only around £16,000. So it doesn't take a genius to work out, you're only borrowing about 4 times your salary to buy a property. By the middle of the financial crisis, the end of that particular cycle, if you like, the average house price in the UK had swept up to £181,000. The average salary had crawled to £25,000. Instead of borrowing 4 times your salary to buy a property, you are now borrowing 7 or 8 times your salary to buy a property. And by the end of the last cycle, which is the end of 2022, the average house price in the UK was almost 300k, yet the average salary was only 30k. So instead of borrowing 4 times your salary to buy a property, you're now borrowing 10 times your salary to buy a property. And that shows you why relatively small changes to interest rates make an absolutely massive difference to the amount of money that people are shelling out, particularly younger people, those up to about the sort of mid-40s, are shelling out in mortgage payments each month. You come to this thing called the mortgage burden, which is how much of your money each month is going on mortgage payments. Now, at the moment, many people on this call and many people across the UK are still on mortgages fixed at around 2% or less, which is as low as it's ever been, frankly. It's never been much better than that. But when they come to refix, and at the moment, 100,000 people every single month are moving off a fixed rate mortgage to a new fix, instead of looking at 2% for their mortgage, they're probably looking at closer to 6%. The difference there is instead of paying 17 or 18% of their salary in mortgage payments, they're suddenly going to move up to 26 or 27% of their salary in mortgage payments, literally overnight. And that shows you why we still have a real challenge with financial health here, because it's not just about inflation. It's also about how much people are paying for where they live. That, incidentally, is almost the highest mortgage burden on people since 1991. So that is something that I don't think is appreciated enough by the national media. In terms of renting, well, rents have gone up too. Perhaps not quite so dramatically sometimes, but they have gone up. The average rent outside of London has gone up by 10%, but the more important figure is that viewings per property were, before the pandemic, 6 per property. They are now 20 plus per property. If everybody wants apples, then the price of apples goes up. If everybody wants a particular property, then the property price, or the property rent in this case, goes up too. So we're not out of the woods financially. We're in a better place than we were, but we're certainly not out of the woods. And that means if we take everything together, we know that physical and mental well-being, which are at the mercy of the National Health Service, are in trouble. We know financial well-being is slightly better than it was a year ago, but is still in trouble. And that means that we need to be focusing on what this means for our workers, their output and their productivity, or indeed our own, if that's the case. What does it mean for engagement and productivity? Well, if you're not paying people enough and they're not feeling very good about life, it means they're not going to be engaged. They're not going to be engaged with their job. They're not going to be engaged with their company. And if you look at how engaged we are at work in the UK compared to the rest of Europe, you can see that we're not. We are 33rd out of 38 countries in terms of engagement, which is really, really poor. So that is a problem. If we haven't got engaged people, they're not going to be productive. And if they're not productive, then we all lose out in the long term. But you may be thinking, well, why are we looking at Europe? We're not in Europe anymore. Well, firstly, let's get that out of the way. Geographically, we are and always will be. Secondly, our biggest customers and our biggest competitors are European because they're closest to us. So we do need to be competitive against them. But if I take your point and look at how engaged we are compared to, let's say, North America and Australasia, the old English speaking world, if you like, because that's probably where Brexit is taking us. Well, the reality is we're not engaged with them at all. They are way more engaged. They are way more productive. They are generally in a better place than we are. So we need to be thinking about how we look after our employees because if we don't, they won't be engaged. If they're not engaged, they won't be productive. Low engagement leads to increased absence. People are more likely to take a sick day if they're feeling a little bit off color, if they don't really like what they're doing. It certainly leads to lower productivity. People going home at 10 to 5 rather than 10 past 5. And it reduces growth of the nation and indeed your own company. But again, something that's often overlooked is that one there. People that are less engaged are more likely to make mistakes. If you look back to last week and the CrowdStrike IT outage, that wasn't about hacking, that wasn't about criminality, that was about human error in the coding, and it took down half the planet's IT basically. 88% of data breaches are caused by human error. So it's in all of our interests to keep ourselves fit, healthy, and at work and engaged with being at work. All of which takes us to some of the government's many changes announced in the King's Speech, but the ones that are particularly relevant to the world of employment and employers. Now, we have two documents here. The one on the left was the official manifesto from the Labour Party. And the one bit I'm going to take from that is that quote there. The reality is, one of the things they've moved away from is these knee-jerk changes that we've seen over the last few years, particularly around national insurance. They have been crazy. They have been far too rapid. They haven't had time to be put into place properly. And incidentally, they did end up with me having a rather nice bit of consultancy work, unraveling a company that made a real mess because of all the national insurance changes. So I was quite pleased with it. But generally, it's not the way to do business. So the government has said, okay, if we're going to make big changes, we're going to make them with enough time for you to get this right. So that's got to be welcomed. What will be less welcomed by employers is the sheer number of changes from the document on the right. Now, this was produced before the manifesto, May, I think, to be precise. It was talking about how to make work pay, which, as I think we've already said, we need to do, but it does have an awful lot of components for employers to be aware of. Here are just some of them, not all of them. And you can see it's a big, long list, and it is already in train. It has been announced in the King's Speech. The government have promised to introduce this legislation in the first 100 days of their government. And the clock is already ticking on that. We're 3 weeks in. So this is coming fast, and it's something we all need to be aware of. Now, much of these things are essentially a conclusion, a carrying on of stuff that was already in train. The national living wage, we all know about, voice at work, day one rights. But there are a couple of things in there that I think are important and will cause problems. Changes to 0-hour contracts, I think, is a big one for many of you. At one point, they were looking at banning 0-hour contracts altogether, which I think would be chaos for the UK. They've now rowed back on that a little bit. So it's just changes to 0-hour contracts. But that's something for us all to be aware of. And certainly for any larger employers in the room today, we're going to see an extension of pay gap reporting. So we have got gender pay gap reporting, but it's taken a bit of a back seat since the pandemic. That's going to come back in spades, so we all have to do something with it. We're also going to have disability pay gap reporting and ethnicity pay gap reporting. And these are things I think that are going to cause a lot of problems for employers. But the bit that wasn't mentioned, which I think is something we need to take away from this, is a significant change to pensions tax relief. I was talking about taking away tax breaks. I think this is one that will come. Wasn't mentioned at all, but I think everything is set for this. So if you go back to 2016, George Osborne, the then Chancellor, was going to radically change pensions tax reliefs. He didn't because of the forthcoming EU referendum. And every year since, it's been mooted that this will happen. Now I think it will. So if you look at the High Speed 2 scrapping last year, Rishi Sunak's decision, which was right or wrong, but it happened, he did that to save £32 billion at one stroke of the pen, a significant sum of money. Pensions tax relief costs the UK Treasury £50 billion every single year. Will that survive for much longer? I doubt it. So if you take nothing from this, I would suggest that the one thing the government can do to make a difference to their bottom line is take away pensions tax relief or at least change it dramatically. And that means that you and your employees need to be thinking about where that leaves you with pensions. My rule of thumb on pensions is always make hay while the sun shines. We have a really generous system of pensions tax reliefs. We should be making sure that you and your employees are taking advantage of that whilst it's there, because it may not be there for much longer. And just be aware that that is likely to change sooner rather than later. It's bad news. So any government will get the bad news out of the way in the first 2 years of the parliament in the hope that we forget about that by the next time we come to vote. So my final thoughts. Firstly, the economic situation is genuinely dire. You know, when the government are talking about this being the worst situation since the Second World War, that's probably true. It's very difficult to think of a worse situation than this. But we have got, fortuitously or otherwise, a bit of growth in the economy. We might have reached rock bottom and be bouncing a bit. We have more confidence by luck rather than judgment, and we have the probability of more money coming into the UK, which will all help. Second point, the NHS is genuinely broken. We don't want it broken, but it is. The correction, which will undoubtedly come over the next 5 to 10 years, will take that long to make a difference. So if we're looking to keep people fit, healthy, and at work, we can't rely on the NHS in the meantime. And the last point, which is important, is that workforce wellbeing and indeed your own wellbeing and your engagement and productivity are all issues that you can do something about and should. The state can only do so much. Some of this stuff we can make a big difference with ourselves. Last point, there is a political honeymoon period. We are in it now. It won't last forever because it never does. So expect to see most of the big changes happening in the first 2 to 3 years of this parliament, and make sure you're ahead of that curve, because fundamentally we need to bounce back from where we've been. That's pretty much me done, and I've not made a great deal of that, so I apologise. That's the kind of the stuff I do. I also get involved, obviously, in employee benefits and that jazz as well. Very happy to pass back to Henry and take any questions if there are any.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Steve. A very informative presentation. I'm sure everybody here would agree. So yeah, now is your chance. If you do have any questions that you would like to ask Steve, please do unmute and ask away. Put your hand up, put your question in the chat. Does anyone have anything to kick us off?
Tumbleweed's always good.
Yeah, means you've got all the information out there.
I did have a question, if I could ask a question.
Of course.
Perfect.
I wondered what you meant by engagement. What exactly is the definition of engagement? You gave the percentages for different countries. So UK was 11%. I think the USA was 34%.
Yeah.
But are you defining it in terms of productivity per employee, or is there a wider definition of engagement?
It's a great question, and there's many answers, none of which I'm particularly comfortable with. The one I tend to go with most is Gallup's. So Gallup do this national survey, and those stats you saw earlier on were from Gallup, the polling company. And they ask a particular set of questions to see how engaged people are with their work and or their company. Now, that's not about productivity. That is literally about whether, if you like what you're doing. You're engaged with the job, you find it interesting. And there's loads of stats, and always has been out there, that the more engaged you are with your work, the more productive you will be. Productivity, on the other hand, is easier to gauge because actually, essentially, it's those growth figures we're looking at divided by the number of people working in the UK. And we know those figures are, and have been for a long time now, actually, pretty desperate in the UK. So if you've got engagement at a low level, depending on which definition you're using, but just essentially in simple terms, think of it about being happy and productive at work. You like being there. and you've got productivity that we know is low. We put those two things together, and there is a clear correlation between the two. There's lots of other things around productivity, by the way, infrastructure and all that sort of stuff. It's all really key. But nevertheless, engagement plays a big part in it, and we don't have an engaged workforce. So there's no easy answer to that. It's a great question, but I would point you towards the Gallup poll, which at least asks things in a structured way.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank us for the question. Does anybody else have any other questions at all?
Yeah, just myself, Michael, Marshall Drone Service. I think probably people realise over the last few years, nobody's going to be spending any money. I think it has affected businesses quite a lot. Hopefully, this new government, I know nobody's slating, as I do, politicians. Nobody has lots of politician. But hopefully, next few years, things will improve and businesses will want to start spending money. Do you probably agree with that?
I think there's already some. I mean, if you look at the growth data, there is already some evidence that people are spending a little bit more. It's very hard to say at this stage just how tangible that is. But you're right. I mean, the biggest problem, really, since even before the pandemic, certainly since the pandemic, has been that people haven't been splashing the cash for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes they just couldn't physically splash the cash because of the pandemic. There is certainly much you can sense, anecdotally, if you go out to the shops now, you see people going on holiday, that people are spending a bit more than they were. So that's good. Those national insurance cuts, which, fundamentally I think were probably a mistake, but I think they have put a bit more money in people's pocket to spend. So that's probably helping as well. But if we get that confidence, if we get that feel good factor, which is intangible, it's very hard to say where it comes from, but we're kind of there. We kind of had it at the start of the Blair government from a Britpot and all that stuff as well. It's just when things just happen coincidentally at the same time, then people will start spending. And if we can get people spending, then that circle, that confidence and investment circle starts rotating as well. So hopefully we're in a better place than we were, more by luck than judgment. But hey, we'd take that after the last few years.
Perfect. Thank you. And thank you, Michael, for your question. Any final thoughts before we conclude today's session? If you do have any other questions that you don't potentially feel comfortable asking on this, Steve's put the link to his website at the end of his presentation there, so I'm sure there's contact details on there for Steve should you want to discuss further with him anything that we've discussed today. So if there are no other questions, then that will be that. So I'd just like to thank you all ever so much for coming along today to this edition of Business Bites. Obviously, massive thank you to Steve for the presentation. I hope you all had got a lot out of that. I know that I certainly took a lot of points away as well. So yeah, I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day and take care. Thank you very much.
Thanks, folks.